By the 1950s, Zeiss Ikon had reestablished its camera making operation and had produced several folding cameras, possibly a box camera. Although I'm not really positive on the box Tangor. In the time between the end of World War II and the 1950s, there was some growing interest in single lens reflex cameras, and this is Zeiss Ikon, which of West Germany. This is its first. This is its first SLR, and you'll notice right up here, it has the little Zeiss Ikon emblem engraved into the pentaprism housing. This is a fairly small SLR, and it lacks modern features of today, such as a meter and a rapid return mirror, and quite a few other things. But it's one of my favorites. I've shot with this. The lens on it is a Tessar. It only carried a Tessar in the early days, or at least in the first couple of models. Later, it offered several other lenses, but the Tessar was always the premium lens. It never carried anything better than a Tessar, such as the planar or any other type, although it did offer, I think, a Pantar at one point. However, the Tessar is really a very sharp lens, and anybody who uses it, I think, will be very satisfied with this lens. This was the first of a dozen models, well, actually 13 if you count the Contaflex 126. I should mention real quickly that there was a pre-war Contaflex camera. It was a twin lens 35mm camera. We'll discuss that in a different video. This series, however, was always intended for the amateur. However, it had quite a few things going for it. So let's take a quick look around the camera. This camera, or this particular model, being the first, always came with a synchro computer shutter, and it always came with a Tessar, 45mm f2.8 Tessar. We'll discuss the lens in a little bit because there's something I wanted to mention about it. So it had speeds running from 1/500th down to 1 second plus B. This was a leaf shutter, obviously, being a synchro computer shutter. Apertures ran from f2.8 down to f22, and on the top deck you had a small film minder dial, and you had on one side, and it really displayed the film speeds either in, well, it displayed them both in ASA and DIN. On the right side you had your shutter release and your film advance knob and your frame counter. On top here is an accessory shoe. It's not a hot shoe, it's an accessory shoe. And this was an accessory shoe that was optional. Didn't always have to be attached to the camera. So if you remove the accessory shoe, with the accessory shoe removed, it gives it a slightly different look with and without the shoe. I tend to leave it on. I don't know why, but I tend to leave it on. And I say I don't know why because I don't think I've ever shot flash with this camera, but how it attaches is it has a small cutout for the eyepiece, and you simply lay it on top. Well, you unscrew the eyepiece guard, put that on top, and then screw that eyepiece guard back on, and that's that. On the side here is a synchronization post, and as you can see, it's set up for both flash, which is X, and M, which would be bulb. So it's set up for two types of flash synchronization. Finally, you'll notice a little setting here called V. V is the self-timer. And so to engage a self-timer, you simply pull down on that lever. Well, let's tension the shutter. And then when you release the shutter, it would then count down, and generally you got a 10-second delay before the shutter then released. This did not have a rapid return mirror. So when you took a photo, the viewfinder went dark and stayed dark. So quite a bit happened when you took a photograph. So first of all, it had to close the shutter. Then it raised the mirror, take the aperture and put it to your selected aperture. You would close the aperture down to your selected aperture. Then it would fire the shutter. It would open and close the shutter according to whatever speed you had selected. So, you know, there was quite a bit going on. It wasn't simply just release the shutter and then that would be it. As I mentioned before, this did not have a rapid return mirror. So when you took a photo, the viewfinder went dark and stayed dark. On the back, there's not much to note other than the Zeiss Ikon emblem or logo engraved into the back. So on the bottom of the camera, you have your two keys for removing the back of the camera. You have your tripod socket, and it is in alignment with the center of the lens. And you had your rewind button. This is a button which meant it was a press and hold affair. While you rewound the film, you had to keep this button depressed the entire time. Thankfully, it's large. You'll notice this little pin right here, and its sole purpose was to allow the camera to stand upright without tilting forward. When it's time to rewind the film, I've generally found it useful to use your thumb on your left hand and simply twist. This does not raise, it does not have a crank, so rewinding the film takes a bit longer. There are no surprises with that. That was just pretty much the common method for rewinding film in the 1950s. I'm not sure when the rewind crank came into being. I'm going to guess that it was probably a Japanese innovation. This had a removable back, as did most German cameras. So you turn these keys, and the back slides off. This actually had a removable film spool. This film spool was the same one that was used in the Contax cameras. In fact, you could use the Contax film cassettes in the Contaflex. You also could use a standard 35mm cassette, but if you wanted to preload your own film into the Zeiss Ikon film cassettes, you could use two of them, one for the take-up spool and one for the feed spool, one for your fresh roll film. So this would go in on one side, and it has this little notch here that would mate to this small indentation here. Same on the other side, notch, indentation. What you would have to do is take the film out of, you would take the film leader, you would take the film leader, and then you would insert it into the take-up spool on this side. Oops, there we go. Then you would close the back. When you close the back, what it does is when you turn these keys, it opens up that slide on each side. So then you simply took your photos and the film would then run across. When you use two film cassettes, it eliminated the need to rewind the film, which made things easier, particularly if you're processing your own film. If you're sending the film out to be processed, then it's not as convenient because there's no guarantee that the company is going to return your film cassette. The Contaflex later offered its own interchangeable back. It was not compatible with other cameras, only worked with the Contaflex. For most of my purposes, I just use the standard take-up spool. As I mentioned, this camera uses a leaf shutter. This is a little baffle that blocks light. When it's positioned like this means the shutter has been tensioned. It means the aperture is open, the mirror is in its focusing position, which is 45-degree angle, and the baffle would block any stray light coming in through the front of the lens or the aperture. Once you release the shutter, you'll notice that the baffle and mirror flip upward. You may have seen the shutter open briefly, and then the shutter remains closed, thereby preventing any stray light from coming in through the lens. So how does this compare with other cameras? So with a modern day camera, let's take a look at the here it is compared, well, let's put it this way. Here it is side by side with a Pentax ME. And you'll notice that it's roughly the same width. The body is the same width. What about height? So if we were to go by height, the Contaflex is slightly taller. And the Contaflex has a somewhat thicker body. You can see how thick this is as opposed to this. Now, the earliest Contaflex, as I mentioned, had no meter. There was the next Contaflex, the Contaflex 2, introduced a selenium meter. It was a lot like the other selenium meters, what was fitted to the Contessa and several other cameras, in which there was a small meter flap. One was for day. It was a two-range meter. With the meter flap down, that was for outside use, daylight, and with the meter flap up, that was for indoors. And there was a small knob over here that you turned, and it used a match needle system. It was fairly accurate. This is a front cell focusing tessar, which means when you focus a lens, only the front element moves. The other three elements of the four-element tessar remain fixed in place. In theory, a front cell focusing tessar is not as sharp as a unit focusing tessar. In practice, though, I haven't really found photos taken with this tessar to be lower quality. In fact, I found it to be pretty darn sharp. Handling the camera is actually quite easy because it is a smaller camera. It's quite easy to hold. Just hold this in your hand, use these to focus, and you're good to go. The viewfinder is very basic. However, one nice thing that Zeiss Ikon did from the start is they used a split image circle in the center of the viewfinder as a focusing aid. And that's something that other camera makers didn't introduce right away. But with Zeiss Ikon, it was there from the start when it came to the Contaflex. This is an all-metal camera, and being an all-metal camera, it has considerable weight. As I mentioned, the Contaflex used initially, the first two models used this 45mm f2.8 Tessar. This is very similar. In fact, it's very likely that it's identical to the lenses that were used for the Ikonta, Contina, and Contessa cameras. It looks a bit the same, but it looks a bit different, but really it's, I would say it's the same lens and same lens elements. And it would make sense from a production standpoint because you only had to produce one lens and you could actually produce four models. Right, you could do the Contina, you could do the Ikonta, the Contina, then you could do the Contessa and the Contaflex. The other thing that's a tip-off is the close focus distance. So the close focus distance on this is 3 feet, just shy of 3 feet, and the close focus distance on this is also just shy of 3 feet. So that's why it would indicate to me that these really are the same lenses, just set in slightly different barrels. Let's look at the weight of this camera. 1 pound 8 ounces. Not a surprise. There's for its size, there's significant weight to this camera. Now, how about the Pentax ME, the one we were just looking at? So this is 1 pound 5 ounces. So the Contaflex actually weighs 3 ounces more. Again, not a surprise given that this camera probably has more plastic in its construction. And real quickly, we'll look at the Contina 2, and that weighs 1.3 ounces. Now that we've been talking about the Contessa, let's see what the weight of the Contessa is. That comes in at 1.5 ounces. So, obviously weighs more than this, has more features, but it's still less than the Contaflex at 1.8 ounces. It's still 3 ounces less. So each of these cameras have their strengths and weaknesses. This one's probably portability. This one is full featured. And this one offers reflex viewing. So the focusing is going to be much more precise than on either of these two. This one actually is this one's going to be very precise, of course, because this is rangefinder. This is an uncoupled rangefinder, so it's not going to be quite as precise. What are some things to consider if you're looking at one of these cameras? Number one, does the shutter work? It's not uncommon for a leaf shutter to require service. In fact, you should almost assume that any camera with a leaf shutter is probably going to need service. Number two, the viewfinders in these cameras, because they're now 70 years old, are probably going to be pretty dusty. They're going to have black specks in them. They're just going to be dirty, and then they're going to need to be cleaned. So always keep that in mind. Number three, always make sure it has a take-up spool. If it doesn't have a take-up spool, you can always use a standard 35mm spool and sort of fashion a take-up spool yourself. You can usually just use some masking tape. I would recommend the blue masking tape because that seems to work what's best. Number four, Check the condition of the pentaprism. If you see a black line, a black vertical line in the pentaprism, it means the prism is being desilvered. At that point, don't buy that camera. The only way to correct that is to replace the prism, and the only way to replace the prism today is to find a Contaflex that has a good prism. Number 5, is there any physical damage to the camera? If you see a lot of dents and dings in the prism housing or on the body, just buy another. There are enough cameras on the market that there's no reason to purchase a damaged camera. And finally, number 6, are you prepared to use a camera that doesn't have a meter? For me, that's not a big deal. You know, get yourself a good, reliable light meter, and you'll always be ready for any situation. This is nice because this camera requires no batteries. All it really requires is simply a roll film and you. Number 7. Did I do number 6? Finally, keep in mind that this is a fixed lens camera. You cannot interchange lenses. You cannot. There was an accessory device that's slotted in on the bottom, and it was a 1.7x telephoto accessory. I've used it, and I didn't find that it degraded image quality that much, or really at all. There also were some other accessories specifically for this camera, including a stereo adapter, and that allowed you to take stereo photos. And so you would get 2 shots per frame, and then you would use a special stereo viewer to view your photos afterward. Sort of a cool little device, obviously a specialty device. So how would I rate this camera? I would give this camera a solid 9.0. Once it's been serviced and cleaned, this camera will give you many years of service. The Tessar is a very sharp lens. It will, at a 45mm focal length, it's really ideal for nearly all purposes. Obviously, it's not a wide-angle lens and it's not telephoto, but you know, for most of your photography, this is going to work just fine. This camera easily handles black and white and color film. You do have to get used to the removable back. That was a staple of the German camera industry. Hinge backs really didn't become popular until much later in the probably the 1960s, I guess. This camera, compared with Japanese cameras, of course, does not have a film advance lever. It has a film advance knob, which means you simply turn this, it would tension the shutter, it would advance the frame counter, and it would open the aperture to its maximum opening. So here you have it, the first Zeiss Ikon 35mm single lens reflex camera. It's a very modest camera, yet it's a very good camera. If you can find one in good condition, you'll be very pleased with the results. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, think about hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you have a question or a comment, please leave it in the chat below. Or if you'd like, you can always send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And I'll see you on the next video.